I'm still sick, but not sick of these combos. What if you played a Magic card that didn't want you to play the game? Standstill is one of the most interesting enchantments I've ever come across in my time playing Eternal Magic, and it's one that has a home not only in 60 card constructed, but in multiplayer as well. A card that doesn't want you casting spells, but your opponent, so that you can draw your own cards. How do you break the symmetry on such an interesting enchantment? Well, that's what I wanted to go over today. Now, if you want to see more deep dives of singular cards that I've come across in my time playing Magic, then leave a like on the video. Let me know what you want to see more of. I can't always be complaining about Universes Beyond or just whatever's going on constructed. Positive content has to exist. Standstill is blue in 1 for an enchantment that says whenever a player casts a spell, sacrifice this enchantment. If you do, each of that player's opponents draws 3 cards. So first and foremost, if you play Standstill and you cast a spell after that, you sacrifice it and your opponent draws 3 cards. The idea with this is ideally your opponent has to cast a spell into this to give you value. This isn't winning you the game, it isn't part of some combo, it's an enchantment that you're able to potentially recur or just get some type of value off of to continue your engine going. In the Legacy format, it's a blue card, it pitches to Force Negation, Force of Will, so there is that aspect of it when it comes to the mid-range and control decks. But when it comes to Commander, there is so much politicking happening here, because again, it requires your opponent to not do something that they're built to do, especially if you play it early. You know, that opponent that, you know, you play this on turn 2, that opponent that's looking to cast their Farseek, all of a sudden may not be getting the value that you're looking for. They might be getting ahead on mana, but then you're allowing your opponents to draw 9 total cards in a multiplayer format. But let's take it from the aspect of singleton. When it comes to something like this, you're breaking the symmetry by forcing your opponents to do something that they usually want to do. The problem with this is ideally, you know, if your opponent is casting into this, you don't want them winning the game, because you want to be able to draw your cards and then control from there. The big problem is that, yes, your opponent can then, you know, force you to draw cards and you might be able to find an answer after your opponent's card is still on the stack, which is the key. So that card goes on the stack, Standstill goes on the stack, resolves first. You can still find a counterspell and resolve it there, but that doesn't mean that you necessarily draw into what you need. For example, against the combo decks that are around in Legacy right now, you may not draw into the Force of Will, you might draw into the Graveyard Hate, which you can't exactly cast at instant speed. Now, notably in the Legacy format, you're looking at something like Jeskai Standstill or Azorius Blue-White X Standstill. No, really what you're looking at here is some type of Brainstorm, Ponder, Force of Will control deck, but you're using cards like Timeless Dragon, which is pretty sweet, to create copies of a threat that you don't actually need to cast. You just internalize. You exile this card from your graveyard, you create a token that's a copy of it, except it's a 4/4 black zombie. So you're creating threats that you're not even casting. Yes, you have cards like Sapcaster Mage, Teferi Time Raveler, but you're playing Planeswalkers that provide continuous value that aren't casting spells. Standstill's only a 4 of, you're not necessarily like recasting it or digging for it hard, but you're playing it as a card, again, that pitches to Force of Will, but also provides you value on the field, allowing you to draw into your removal, your ample amount of counter magic like Spell Pierces and Prismatic. Unfortunately, a deck that's hard control like this isn't that popular right now. You're boarding into a bunch of red cards, but really the main plan of this deck is just too slow. When it comes to Standstill in Legacy currently, pre-June 30th ban, it's just not fast enough. Right now, a bunch of the tempo decks have some type of mid-range plan, but they also have an instant win button. For example, Dimir Reanimator and Dimir Tempo largely are operating on the axis of reanimation. Dimir Tempo a little bit different, Orcish Bowmasters, Nethergoyf, all that stuff, but it just turns out the reanimate package on blue is just still, you know, powerful enough. Like if you look at this, Kaido, Murktide Regent, Orcish Bowmasters, they're still playing like mainboard Nihil Spellbombs, Forceful Days, Thoughtseize, whatever. They're still disrupting much of the package, and mid-range is allowed to exist. For example, this isn't the worst metagame in the world, but that is just by numbers. Dimir Reanimator is at the top of the metagame, and it might just be time for Entomb to take the ban, but that's a whole other discussion. Let me know if you want me to make a video on that. Oops All Spells gives a consistent turn 1 win with protection. So a 2-mana enchantment that just draws you 3 cards is not what you're looking for. Yes, it can draw you 3 cards into the Force of Will or the extra days or whatever you need to stop the Balustrade Spy from resolving. That's pretty fair, but it doesn't guarantee that. So when it comes to other decks like the Izzet Delver decks and Painter decks, they're just going to have you dead. For example, if you're drawing 3 cards, if your opponent casts Orcish Bowmasters, yes, you draw 3 cards before the Orcish Bowmasters resolves, but it's not going to be good, or it's not going to feel that great to resolve your future copies of Standstill, Ponders, Brainstorms, whatever. You have Prismatics and Swords, yes, but still a 2-mana enchantment is just a little too slow. So once the control decks of the format come back into the format, right now the closest thing to a control deck, I believe, is honestly lands. The rest of the decks are more so tempo strategies. They're not hard control. Again, the hard control deck is probably, the closest one is probably lands. The rest of them are some level of mid-range tempo, combo, or like combo mid-range, like Painter's a bit of a hybrid. Otherwise, it's just straight combo. And so the metagame is really fast, right? It wants to interact quick, land a threat quick, and just beat you down. It doesn't want to play the long game, albeit beatstock control is still somehow putting up numbers. But when it comes to Commander, though, we still do have other things that we can do. Now, notably in a multiplayer format, Commander's really important because the idea that if an opponent casts a spell into this, that player's opponents are going to draw a total of 9 cards, right? So it's 3/3/3. You are giving 3 cards to each player just to be able to cast a spell. It's a very polarizing card, and there's a lot of ways that you can abuse this. Of course, in Commander, if your opponent plays something like a giant win condition that just wins on the spot, that may not be exactly what you're looking to do with Standstill. You may not draw the cards that you need, especially in like a bracket 3, bracket 4 situation. You may not have the depth of interaction needed. Now in CDH, this is more of a polarizing card because, yes, your opponent's casting into it. They might just be putting a win on the stack, but then your other opponents that are also potentially blue or potentially able to play at instant speed are going to draw the cards they need to potentially put their win on the stack. So Standstill, not exactly the best card when it comes to CDH. And honestly, when it comes to EDH and bracket 4, bracket 3 games, it may not be exactly what you need. So in that mid game, it might just be that group hug value that you need to take advantage of some extra draws, some extra ramp, whatever it is. So really, you're looking to take advantage of this in something like Xyrus Writhing Storm. Xyrus says whenever an opponent draws a card, except the first one they draw each turn on the draw step, create a 1/1 green snake token. So again, when you cast a spell into this, you can proactively make you can make 3 1/1 green snake tokens, and whenever Xyrus deals combat damage to that player, you and that player each draw that many cards. So a pretty solid card. You're going to be able to make a bunch of snakes off of this solid card in there. If you just go do a simple EDH rec search, you're going to be able to find the best card or is most often played in something like Heliod Radiant Dawn. When Heliod enters, return target enchantment card that isn't a god from your graveyard to your hand. So if you've already used Standstill, you're going to be able to bring it back. Otherwise, Heliod, the Warped Eclipse that you're going to be able to flip into, says you may cast spells as though they had flash, and spells you cast cost 1 less for each card your opponent has drawn this turn. So you can imagine, it says your opponents. So you can imagine if you cast Heliod, if you cast Standstill, you can forcibly cast a low-cost spell. Your opponents draw 3/3/3. They draw 9 cards in total. You can just start dropping massive, huge Eldrazi creatures, colorless cards, whatever it is, for free. Just for free. Spells you control. You can just play a bunch of colorless cards all at once. This is a slam dunk card when it comes to in combination with Standstill. Obviously a staple card in a deck like this. So those are some of the examples of situations where you can use a card like this. When it comes to Standstill, really cool card that has a niche spot in a legacy deck, not so much in vintage, and has a home when it comes to group hug in Commander, but does have some offensive cases as well. Obviously, you could use this in Muldrotha as well to force your opponent to draw out a bunch of cards, or just recur it over and over again to put your opponents in a bad spot. So for example, you could recast a bunch of cards out of your graveyard. The last card you cast as an enchantment is going to be Standstill. You pass the turn, your opponents have to do something, they draw you more cards. Again, more examples of Commanders where something like this is lights out. Such a great value engine and a really great politicking tool to be able to force something like this. Yes, your opponent can put wins on the stack and ignore this. The value that you're getting out of cards in the mid to late game can be too powerful, but when it comes to the early game, this can be a real frustrating piece to play against just because it's so much free value, especially if your commander is able to recur it. But let me know what you think of a card like Standstill. Let me know if you've ever heard of a card like this, and let me know where you're using Standstill. Obviously, if you're playing Legacy, you might be aware of Just Guide Standstill, but where are you using a card like this in Commander?